Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what's legal? What would you do if following the rules meant breaking someone's heart forever? Officer Daniel Rivers stood in the sterile corridor of Northgate Correctional Institute, his polished boots clicking against the concrete floor. The Pennsylvania facility hummed with its usual tension, but today felt different. Today, someone was scheduled to die. For 11 years, Daniel had worn the uniform with pride. 36 years old, married with twin boys, he was known throughout Northgate as the officer who never bent the rules. His colleagues joked that Daniel Rivers was so by the book, he probably read the employee handbook for fun. And honestly, they weren't far off. But could a single conversation change everything you believed in? Could one person's desperation crack the foundation of your entire career? It was a frozen March morning when Daniel drew the shift that would haunt him forever. Catherine Mills, prisoner number 847392, had exactly 9 hours left to live. Her execution was scheduled for 7 p.m. that evening. The state of Pennsylvania was preparing to administer lethal injection for a crime that had divided the nation. But here's what most people didn't know about Catherine Mills. Do you want to hear the truth behind the headlines? 4 years earlier, Catherine had killed her husband, Richard Mills, a prominent Pittsburgh attorney. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded murderer who wanted insurance money. But the evidence they ignored? Hospital records showing 7 visits for suspicious injuries. Police reports that were mysteriously filed and forgotten. Neighbors who heard screaming but were too afraid to testify. Catherine Mills had been a prisoner long before she entered Northgate. She'd been trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing her. And the night she finally fought back? That was the night the law decided she was a monster. What would you have done in her position? When do you stop being a victim and become a survivor? And when does survival become murder in the eyes of the law? Daniel approached her cell that morning expecting to find a woman broken by fear, maybe crying, possibly angry. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Catherine Mills sat cross-legged on her narrow bunk, reading a children's book. Her auburn hair was pulled back neatly. Her green eyes were clear and focused. She looked up when his shadow fell across the bars. "Officer Rivers," she said softly, reading his name tag. Her voice was steady, almost calm. "Good morning." How could someone facing death in hours sound so composed? What gives a person that kind of strength when they are staring into the abyss? "Morning, Daniel replied, maintaining his professional distance. The training manual was clear about death row protocol. Minimal engagement. Maintain emotional detachment. Report any unusual behavior. But something about this woman made those rules feel hollow. Catherine returned to her book, and Daniel took his position at the monitoring desk 12 feet from her cell. The next 3 hours passed in strange silence. She read. She paced occasionally. She drank water from a plastic cup. She didn't cry. She didn't rage against her fate. She just existed in these final moments with a grace that seemed impossible. Have you ever watched someone face their mortality with such dignity? What does it say about a person when they can find peace in their darkest hour? At 11:30 a.m., Catherine set down her book and walked to the bars. "Officer Rivers," she called gently. "May I ask you something personal?" Daniel's first instinct was to refuse. Personal conversations weren't allowed. But something in her eyes, a quiet desperation mixed with hope, made him pause. "What is it?" he asked, staying seated. "Do you have children, Officer Rivers?" Her voice cracked slightly on the word children. Why do people always ask about children in their final hours? What is it about parenthood that cuts through every other human experience? "I can't discuss my personal life," Daniel responded, but his voice was gentler than protocol required. Catherine nodded, understanding the boundary. "I have a daughter," she said quietly. "Her name is Emma. She just turned 8 years old last week. 8 years old, and she had a birthday party without her mother because I've been here for 4 years. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He did have children. Twin boys, Marcus and Julian, both 10 years old. He knew what it felt like to love someone so much it physically hurt. He knew what it meant to be a parent. What separates us from the people we guard? Is it really just a matter of circumstances and choices? Could any of us end up on the other side of those bars? "My sister Jennifer has been raising Emma," Catherine continued, gripping the bars now. "She thinks it's better if Emma forgets about me. She says a child shouldn't grow up knowing her mother was executed. She says it's kinder to let Emma believe I died in an accident." Tears finally appeared in Catherine's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. But what about Emma? What about when she's older and starts asking questions? What about when she needs to know that someone loved her unconditionally? Is it better to forget painful truths or to know you were loved despite impossible circumstances? What would you want if you were that child? Catherine reached into the pocket of her orange jumpsuit and pulled out a sealed envelope. The paper was slightly worn, as if she'd been carrying it for days, holding it close to her heart. Officer Rivers, I've written a letter to my daughter. It explains everything. Who I was before the fear took over. Who her father was before the violence started. How much I love her. Why I made the choice I made. And most importantly, that none of this was ever her fault. She held the envelope through the bars, her hand trembling now. My sister will never give this to Emma. She's convinced that ignorance is protection. But I can't leave this world knowing my daughter might grow up thinking I didn't love her enough to leave her something true. What would you risk for someone you've never met? How much would you sacrifice to honor a stranger's dying wish? Daniel stared at the envelope like it was a loaded weapon. Because in a way, it was. Taking that letter meant violating every rule he'd ever followed. It meant risking his job, his pension, possibly even criminal charges. The security cameras were recording everything. His supervisors reviewed footage randomly. One wrong move could destroy his entire career. But not taking it meant what? Letting a little girl grow up believing her mother abandoned her? Letting this woman die knowing her final act of love would be erased? When does compassion become more important than compliance? When does the spirit of justice matter more than the letter of the law? I know what I'm asking, Catherine whispered. I know you could lose everything. But I've watched you these past few days. You look at us like we are still people. Not just numbers. Not just mistakes. And that gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, you understand what it means to love someone more than your own life. Daniel glanced at the security camera in the corner. Its red light blinked steadily, recording this moment for posterity. For investigation. For judgment. His hand hovered near the bars, and he could feel the weight of the choice crushing down on him. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every path leads to pain? Where there's no right answer, only the answer you can live with? I can't promise anything, Daniel finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'll try. His fingers closed around the envelope and slipped it into his uniform pocket in one smooth motion. Catherine's face crumpled with relief, and this time she did let the tears fall. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you for seeing me as more than what I did. Thank you for seeing Emma as more than a condemned woman's child. The rest of Catherine's day unfolded with quiet ceremony. A chaplain came and was politely turned away. Her lawyer arrived with papers she'd already signed. A final meal was delivered, chicken parmesan, which she ate slowly, savoring each bite like a meditation. How do you spend the last hours of your life? Do you rage or do you find peace? Do you fight or do you accept? At 6 p.m., the warden asked if she had any final words for the official record. Catherine looked directly at Daniel and said, "Tell my daughter I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger sooner. Tell her that she was my reason for everything." At exactly 7:03 p.m., Catherine Mills was pronounced dead. The witnesses filed out. The media rushed to break the story. And Daniel Rivers stood at his post, feeling the weight of the letter in his pocket like a stone in his heart. But this isn't where the story ends. In fact, it's barely the beginning. What happens when you carry someone else's secret? How does it change you? That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table while his wife Rebecca cooked dinner and his sons argued about homework in the next room. Normal sounds. Normal life. But nothing felt normal anymore. The letter sat in his desk drawer upstairs, burning a hole through his conscience. Rebecca noticed his unusual silence. "Rough day at work?" she asked, setting a plate of spaghetti in front of him. "Something like that," Daniel murmured, pushing pasta around his plate. "How do you explain to your family that you've risked everything for a promise to a dead woman? How do you make them understand that some things matter more than security?" Over the next weeks, Daniel couldn't shake Catherine's story. He started researching her case during his off hours. Court transcripts revealed a pattern of abuse that the jury had dismissed as irrelevant. Medical records showed injuries consistent with domestic violence. Character witnesses spoke of a woman who'd been systematically destroyed by someone who promised to love her. The more Daniel learned, the more complex his feelings became. Catherine Mills wasn't innocent in the legal sense, but was she really guilty? Or was she a victim who'd finally fought back the only way she knew how? Where's the line between victim and perpetrator? Can someone be both at the same time? 3 months after the execution, Daniel made a decision that would change multiple lives forever. He requested a personal day and drove 4 hours north to Erie, Pennsylvania, where Catherine's sister Jennifer lived with 8-year-old Emma. The neighborhood was quiet and suburban. Tree-lined streets. Kids riding bikes. The kind of place where people went to forget their troubles. Daniel found the address and sat in his car for 20 minutes, gathering courage. What gives you the right to disrupt someone's carefully constructed peace? What makes you think you know better than a grieving aunt? Jennifer answered the door with suspicion in her eyes. A uniformed corrections officer on her porch wasn't a good sign. Daniel quickly explained who he was and why he'd come, watching her expression shift from confusion to anger to something that might have been relief. "You don't understand," Jennifer said, leading him into a modest living room filled with Emma's artwork. "I'm trying to protect her. Every night she has nightmares about a woman she can barely remember. She draws pictures of my sister and asks me if her mommy stopped loving her. How do I tell an 8-year-old that her mother was executed? Is protection the same as lying? Can you build a healthy foundation on incomplete truths?" Daniel placed the letter on the coffee table between them. "Catherine didn't want Emma to forget," he said gently. "She wanted her to understand. There's a difference." Jennifer stared at the envelope like it might explode. "And if I give this to her? If I tell her the truth? What then? What happens when the other kids at school find out her mother was a murderer? What happens if you don't?" Daniel countered. "What happens when she's 16 and finds old news articles online? What happens when she realizes everyone lied to her about the most important person in her life? How do you choose between short-term protection and long-term truth? What's the cost of each path?" Before Jennifer could respond, the front door burst open and a small tornado of energy rushed in. Emma Mills was 8 years old with her mother's auburn hair and green eyes. She wore a backpack covered in unicorn stickers and grass stains on her knees. "Aunt Jen, I scored a goal at soccer today," she announced, then stopped when she saw Daniel in his uniform. "Are you a policeman?" "Sort of," Daniel said, smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. "I work at a place where people go when they make big mistakes." Emma walked closer, studying him with that unfiltered curiosity only children possess. "Did you know my mommy? Everyone says she's in heaven, but nobody talks about her. Do you know what she looked like?" How do you answer a question that could shatter or heal a child's world? "Yes, sweetie," Daniel said, kneeling to her level. "I knew your mommy. And she asked me to tell you something very important." Emma's eyes grew wide. "Really? What did she say?" "She said that you were the most important thing in her whole world. She said you were smart and brave and kind. And she wanted to make sure you always knew how much she loved you." Jennifer wiped tears from her eyes, watching this exchange. "Emma, honey, Officer Rivers brought us something from your mommy. A letter she wrote just for you. Can I read it now?" Emma asked, reaching for the envelope. When is a child ready to know the hardest truths? Is there ever a perfect time? Jennifer looked at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. "Maybe we should wait a little while, sweetheart. Maybe when you're a bit older, like 11 or 12. Some of the words might be hard to understand right now. But you'll keep it safe?" Emma asked, her small hand touching the envelope with reverence. "You promise?" "I promise," Jennifer said, pulling her niece into a hug. "And I promise to tell you stories about your mommy so you'll always know who she really was." Daniel stayed for another hour, sharing carefully chosen memories of Catherine's final days. He told Emma about how her mother loved reading, how she was gentle and thoughtful, how she talked about Emma with such pride and love. He didn't mention the bars or the execution or the crime. Those truths could wait. What's the difference between protecting a child and preparing them? How do you balance innocence with truth? As Daniel drove home that evening, he felt lighter than he had in months. He'd broken the rules. He'd risked his career. He'd made a choice that could have ended badly in so many ways. But he'd kept a promise to a dying woman, and he'd given a little girl a connection to her mother that no one could ever take away. When he got home, Rebecca met him at the door. "You look different," she observed. "What happened?" Daniel pulled his wife close and told her everything. About Catherine, about the letter, about the choice he'd made and the risk he'd taken. He expected her to be angry, to worry about their family's security. Instead, she held his face in her hands and said, I'm proud of you. Sometimes the most important rules are the ones we write in our own hearts. What makes a good person? Is it following every law, or is it knowing when to follow your conscience? For years past, Daniel continued working at Northgate, but something fundamental had changed in him. He still followed protocol, but he saw the inmates differently now. Not as mistakes or threats or case files, but as human beings with stories and pain and people who loved them. He started volunteering with a program that helped children of incarcerated parents. He read to them, listened to their fears, and helped them maintain connections with their mothers and fathers. Every child he helped, he thought of Emma and the letter waiting for her. Can one act of compassion ripple outward and change hundreds of lives? Can breaking one rule lead to fixing a broken system? Then one spring afternoon, Daniel's phone rang with an eerie area code. His heart knew before his mind did. "Officer Rivers, this is Jennifer," the voice said. "Emma is 12 now. She's been asking more questions. Harder questions. I think it's time." "Time for what?" Daniel asked, though he already knew. "Time for her mother's letter. Would you be willing to be here when I give it to her? I think it would help to have you explain things. Is there ever a right time to learn your mother was executed? Is 12 old enough to understand the complexity of justice and survival?" That Saturday, Daniel made the drive to Erie again. The trees were green now, spring flowers blooming in neat gardens. Emma opened the door before he could knock, taller now, but still with those same green eyes. "Officer Rivers," she exclaimed. "Aunt Jen said you were coming. She said you have something important to tell me about my mom." They sat in the same living room, now decorated with Emma's soccer trophies and honor roll certificates. Jennifer held the letter that had waited 4 years for this moment. "Emma, honey," Jennifer began, her voice shaking. "Before I give you this letter, I need to tell you the truth about your mother. About what happened and why she's gone." Emma's face grew serious, more mature than her 12 years. "I know she didn't die in an accident," she said quietly. "I looked it up online last year. I know she killed my father. I know she was executed." How do you respond when a child reveals they've been carrying a terrible secret alone? Jennifer gasped. "You knew? Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you were trying to protect me," Emma said simply. "And I didn't want to make you sad. But I need to know the real story. Not the internet version. The truth." Daniel leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother was in a very dangerous situation, Emma. Your father hurt her for years. She tried to get help, but people didn't listen. And one night, she defended herself and you the only way she knew how. So she protected me?" Emma asked, tears starting to fall. "She saved me?" "She tried to," Daniel said gently. "And then the law punished her for it. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it's what happened." Can children understand moral complexity? Can they hold multiple truths at the same time? Jennifer handed Emma the letter with trembling hands. "Your mother wrote this for you before she died. She wanted you to hear her truth in her own words." Emma opened the envelope carefully, as if it were made of glass. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Catherine's careful script. As Emma read, her expression shifted through a dozen emotions. Pain. Understanding. Love. Grief. Acceptance. When she finished, she looked up with tears streaming down her face. "She says she's sorry she couldn't be braver sooner. She says I was her reason for everything. She says she hopes I grow up to help people who can't help themselves." "What do you think about that?" Daniel asked softly. Emma wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. "I think I want to be a lawyer. I want to help people like my mom. People who are trapped and scared and don't know how to escape. I want to make sure what happened to her doesn't happen to other people." Can tragedy become purpose? Can loss transform into legacy? Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Emma. She'd love knowing that you want to help people." Emma stood and walked over to Daniel, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce hug. "Thank you for keeping your promise to my mom. Thank you for making sure I got to hear her voice." In that moment, Daniel knew that everything he'd risked had been worth it. The broken rules. The sleepless nights. The fear of discovery. All of it led to this, a young girl understanding she was loved beyond measure, even by someone she could barely remember. Years continued to pass. Daniel stayed in touch with Emma and Jennifer, watching from a distance as Emma grew into a remarkable young woman. She excelled in school, particularly in debate and social studies. She volunteered at a domestic violence shelter. She wrote essays about justice reform. When Emma was 18, she called Daniel with news that brought tears to his eyes. "I got into law school," she said, her voice bursting with pride. "Full scholarship to University of Pennsylvania. I'm going to specialize in criminal defense and victim advocacy." How does one person's courage inspire another's calling? How does pain transform into purpose? On the day of Emma's law school graduation, 6 years later, Daniel and Rebecca made the drive to Philadelphia. Emma had invited them to the ceremony, calling them her honorary family. As they watched her receive her diploma, Daniel thought about Catherine Mills and the letter that had started everything. In her valedictory speech, Emma spoke about her mother's story without shame or hesitation. She talked about the failures of the justice system, about how we punish victims while protecting abusers, about the need for compassion alongside law. "My mother made a terrible choice in an impossible situation," Emma said to the crowd of graduates and families. "And the system made a terrible choice in response. But a corrections officer named Daniel Rivers made a different choice. He chose to see my mother as a human being, not just an inmate. He chose to honor her love for me over following every rule. And that choice changed my entire life." She looked directly at Daniel in the audience. "Officer Rivers taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is choose humanity over protocol. Choose compassion over convenience. Choose to see the person, not the crime. And that's the kind of lawyer I intend to be." When does a small act of kindness become a legacy? When does one person's choice ripple outward to change the world? After the ceremony, Emma introduced Daniel to her professors and classmates as the man who changed her life. She showed them the letter, now carefully preserved in a frame, that her mother had written 12 years earlier. "What do you think your mother would say if she could see you now?" Daniel asked as they walked across campus. Emma smiled through happy tears. "I think she'd say that her sacrifice wasn't in vain. That her love survived even when she couldn't. And that maybe, just maybe, some good came from all that pain." Years later, Emma Mills became one of Pennsylvania's leading defense attorneys specializing in domestic violence cases. She won landmark victories for abuse survivors. She changed laws. She saved lives. And she credited every success to two people: the mother who loved her enough to die protecting her, and the corrections officer who loved humanity enough to break the rules. Daniel Rivers retired from Northgate after 30 years of service. He'd been promoted to warden, where he implemented programs that treated inmates with dignity and helped maintain family connections. He never told anyone at work about the letter he delivered that day. Some secrets were worth keeping. What's the measure of a life well lived? Is it the rules we follow or the people we help? On his last day at Northgate, a young officer asked him for advice. Daniel thought about Catherine Mills, about Emma, about all the choices he'd made over 30 years. "Remember that every person behind these walls is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one," he said. "Follow the rules, yes. But never forget to follow your heart too. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do is choose to be human first and an officer second." The young officer nodded, not quite understanding. But he would. Eventually. Just like Daniel had. 20 years after Catherine Mills's execution, Emma Mills stood in front of the Pennsylvania state legislature, advocating for criminal justice reform. Behind her sat Daniel Rivers, now 70 years old, and Jennifer, who'd raised Emma with unwavering love. Emma was proposing a law that would mandate better protections for domestic violence victims who fight back against their abusers. She called it Catherine's Law, in honor of her mother. Can justice be restorative? Can we learn from our mistakes and create a better system? "My mother died believing she'd failed me," Emma told the legislators. "But she didn't fail. She loved me fiercely enough that her love survived her death. And that love, carried forward by compassionate people who chose humanity over bureaucracy, has led to this moment. Led to changes that might save other mothers, other daughters, other families." The bill passed unanimously. Catherine's Law became a model for other states. And Emma Mills continued fighting for justice, carrying her mother's legacy forward with every case she won, every life she saved, every system she changed. On the anniversary of her mother's death each year, Emma would visit Daniel. They'd sit together, talking about Catherine, about choices and consequences, about the strange and beautiful ways that love finds a path even through the darkest circumstances. Do you ever regret it? Emma asked him once. Risking everything to keep that promise? Daniel smiled, looking at the accomplished woman before him. Not for a single second, he said. Your mother's love deserved to reach you. And look what you've done with it. So what's the lesson here? What does this story teach us about justice, about humanity, about the choices we make when nobody's watching? Maybe it's this: rules exist to create order, but compassion exists to create meaning. Laws can't always account for the complexity of human suffering. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is choose to see each other not as criminals or victims or case numbers, but as human beings worthy of dignity and love. Catherine Mills made a terrible choice in a terrible situation. The justice system made a terrible choice in response. But Daniel Rivers made a different kind of choice, a choice rooted in empathy rather than protocol. And that single choice created ripples that changed laws, saved lives, and proved that love really can transcend even the darkest circumstances. So the next time you face a choice between following the rules and following your heart, remember this story. Remember Emma Mills, who became a force for justice because her mother's love reached her through impossible odds. Remember Daniel Rivers, who risked everything to honor a dying woman's final wish. Remember that sometimes being human matters more than being right. What would you have done in Daniel's position? Would you have taken the letter? Would you have risked your career for a stranger's child? Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that compassion can change the world. Because at the end of the day, we are all just trying to love each other through the darkness. And sometimes that's enough to create miracles.